For 6 years, Vivienne Sterling poured more than $3,400,000 into reviving the most prized Chevrolet Bel Air in her collection. The finest specialists in the country had declared the car flawless in every possible way, except for one detail nobody could explain. It had never started, not once, not even for a single second. On the day of the largest classic car exhibition of the year, she mocked a grease-stained stranger who wandered into her private garage uninvited. But when that stranger simply smiled and said, "Give me exactly 3 minutes," the room around them was about to witness something none of them were prepared to believe. The town sat at the edge of autumn, its streets lined with maple trees turning the color of rust and gold. And for one weekend every year, it became the beating heart of American automotive history. Collectors flew in from every coast, some arriving in private jets that landed at a small regional airport barely large enough to hold them all. Photographers lined the velvet ropes outside a converted airplane hangar that now served as the exhibition hall, its steel walls draped in banners announcing sponsors whose names most visitors barely noticed. Inside, beneath soft white light designed to make chrome look like liquid silver, one car sat apart from the rest, covered by a heavy gray cloth, guarded by 2 men in black suits, who did not smile at anyone who approached. Journalists had already given it a name before they had even seen it in person. They called it the Mona Lisa of American automobiles, and Vivienne Sterling had built that reputation one careful headline at a time, feeding stories to the right writers, granting interviews only when it served her. She arrived exactly 11 minutes before the doors opened to the public, dressed in a cream-colored coat, her heels clicking against polished concrete with the confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. 6 years earlier, she had purchased a rusted, sun-bleached 1957 Bel Air from a barn in rural Ohio, a car so far gone that most collectors would have walked past it without a second glance, its frame half buried under decades of hay and dust. She had seen something else entirely. She had seen a legend waiting to be resurrected. And she had spent a fortune making certain the resurrection would be perfect down to the last detail, hiring the best names the industry had to offer, and paying whatever price they asked without ever once negotiating. Every panel had been stripped and reformed by hand by craftsmen flown in from 3 different states. Every bolt, every clip, every strip of trim had been sourced as new old stock, meaning original factory parts that had sat sealed in warehouses for nearly 70 years, untouched by time, tracked down through a network of collectors and estate sales that took specialized brokers months to navigate. The paint alone had taken engineers 4 months to match to the original 1957 factory formula, down to the exact pigment ratio, testing dozens of samples under different lighting conditions until the color-matched period correct photographs almost exactly. The interior had been rebuilt using fabric woven on antique looms, specifically restored for this project alone. Nothing about the car was fake. Nothing about it was a replica. It was, by every metric that mattered to a serious collector, the real thing brought back from the dead. A masterpiece assembled with more patience and precision than most museum restorations ever received, except for one small, humiliating truth that Vivienne had never allowed the press to print. In 6 years, the engine had never once turned over into life. Mechanics turned the key and heard the starter motor grind, heard the electrical hum of a machine trying desperately to breathe, and then nothing. No ignition, no roar, just silence, over and over again. No matter which expert she flew in or how much she paid them, no matter how many diagnostic reports piled up on her desk insisting there was nothing wrong. She had hired engineers who once worked directly for General Motors, men in their 70s who had literally helped design the original ignition systems for that generation of engine, men whose names appeared in old factory manuals, still referenced by restoration shops across the country. She had hired specialists who normally handled 6-figure restorations for the country's most exclusive auction houses, men accustomed to working on cars that sold for the price of a small mansion. Each of them had examined the Bel Air with white gloves and digital diagnostic tools, running compression tests and electrical scans that produced pages of data showing nothing out of place. And each of them, without exception, had walked away shaking their heads, insisting the car was mechanically perfect and that the failure to start defied any reasonable explanation. Standing beside the covered car that morning, surrounded by a small crowd of assistants and reporters, Vivienne allowed herself one moment of raw frustration before her practiced composure returned like a mask sliding back into place. The competition was 3 days away. If the engine did not start by then, 6 years of obsession, patience, and money would end, not with a trophy, but with a truck hauling the car quietly away to a private museum where nobody would ever ask it to prove itself again, where it would sit forever as a beautiful, silent monument to failure. She turned to her assistant and said the words loud enough for the nearby press to hear, because she wanted them printed exactly as spoken. "If nobody in this building can fix it today," she said, "then I will have it towed to the museum myself, and this will be the last anyone hears of it." The words landed like a verdict, sharp and final, and several of the reporters standing nearby scribbled the quote into their notebooks without looking up. Nobody in the small crowd noticed the man who had just stepped through the side entrance of the hangar, wearing a jacket that had clearly seen more oil changes than laundry cycles, carrying a metal toolbox that looked older than most of the cars on display. The security guard at the private garage entrance barely glanced up from his clipboard when the old blue pickup truck rolled to a stop outside, its engine idling with a low, uneven rattle that spoke of countless miles and countless repairs performed by the same hands that built it. Inside sat a man named Gideon Ashcroft, 41 years old, unshaven, with the kind of quiet, unreadable expression that made people assume there was nothing interesting behind it. His hands were stained with the permanent gray of engine grease that never fully washed out no matter how many times he scrubbed them at the end of a long day. He had driven 3 hours from a small garage on the edge of the county, a place with a hand-painted sign and no advertising of any kind, because a friend from the local parts supply house had mentioned there might be work at the exhibition for anyone willing to look under a hood that other people had already given up on. He stepped down from the truck, lifted his worn leather toolbox from the passenger seat, and walked toward the entrance with the unhurried pace of a man who had never once felt the need to prove anything to strangers. The guard stopped him at the velvet rope, assuming from his clothes and his silence that he was a delivery driver who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. "Deliveries go around back," the guard said, already turning away to check something on his clipboard. Gideon did not argue. He simply looked past the guard's shoulder, toward the far end of the hangar, where the gray cloth had just been lifted from the Bel Air for a photographer's session, its chrome catching the overhead lights in a way that made even the most casual passerby stop and stare. Vivienne noticed him first. She noticed the toolbox, the stained jacket, the unpolished boots, and something in her expression shifted from curiosity into amusement, the particular kind reserved for people she considered beneath serious conversation. "This garage," she said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear, "is reserved for people who actually know what they are doing." A ripple of laughter moved through the assistants standing near her, the kind of laughter that exists only to please the person who told the joke, hollow and eager. Gideon did not flinch. He did not smile back, and he did not defend himself with a single word. He simply walked closer to the car, past the velvet rope, past the stunned guard who seemed unsure whether to physically stop him, until he was standing directly in front of the open hood, staring down at an engine that had cost more to restore than most people's houses. Something changed in his eyes as he looked. A flicker of recognition. The kind of look a doctor gets when a routine scan reveals something nobody else had thought to check. He reached out, not touching anything yet, simply tracing the air above the distributor cap with 2 fingers, the way a man might read a page of Braille before ever putting weight on the meaning beneath it. The laughter in the room slowly died down as people noticed his stillness, the sudden seriousness on a face that had shown nothing but calm indifference moments before, and even Vivienne found herself watching more closely than she intended to. "This car," Gideon said quietly, "was never assembled correctly. Not from the very first day." The silence that followed lasted only a second before it broke into open laughter, sharper this time, less polite than before. One of the older engineers standing near the hood, a man who had spent decades consulting for the largest names in the industry, folded his arms and shook his head with the particular condescension reserved for outsiders who wandered into rooms they did not belong in. He rattled off his credentials before anyone asked for them, a resume that included years of engineering work with major manufacturers and decades spent inspecting cars for the most prestigious collector events in the country. Another specialist, flown in specifically because of his reputation at some of the most respected concours judging panels in America, added that he personally had spent 11 hours combing through every wire and connector on this exact engine without finding a single flaw worth mentioning. Vivienne stepped closer, arms crossed, studying Gideon the way she studied underperforming investments, searching for the moment his confidence would crack under the weight of expert opinion. "You think you know better than all of them," she said, gesturing toward the small crowd of specialists surrounding the car, each of them nodding along with her words. Gideon met her eyes for the first time since he had walked through the door. "No," he said. Then, after a pause long enough to make the silence uncomfortable, he added, "I just look at something they don't look at." The laughter returned, louder now, mixed with a few muttered comments from the crowd about amateurs and grease monkeys wasting everyone's valuable time on a day when there was still so much left to prepare. Vivienne allowed herself a thin smile, the kind she used when closing a negotiation she had already won in her head long before the other party finished speaking. "Fine," she said. "If you're so confident, let's make this interesting. If you can start this car, right here, right now, I will personally write you a check for $1 million. If you fail, and every expert who has touched this car has failed, you walk out of this building, and you never speak of it again to anyone." A few gasps rippled through the crowd at the number, though nobody in the room truly expected it to actually change hands by the end of the afternoon. Gideon studied her for a long moment, unreadable as ever, weighing something privately behind his calm expression before finally nodding once. "Deal," he said. He set his toolbox down on the concrete floor beside the car, popped it open, and pulled out nothing more than a small flashlight and a rag, ignoring entirely the cart of expensive diagnostic equipment parked only a few feet away. "Give me 3 minutes," he said, kneeling beside the open engine bay, as the crowd around him fell into a tense, curious hush that seemed to swallow every other sound in the building. He did not reach for a laptop. He did not connect any of the diagnostic equipment stacked neatly on a nearby cart, equipment that had cost more than most cars in the parking lot outside, and had already failed to solve this exact mystery on more than a dozen previous occasions. He simply leaned close to the engine, closed his eyes for a moment, and inhaled slowly, the way a sommelier might study a glass of wine before ever tasting it, reading the faint scent of gasoline and old metal for information nobody else thought to ask for. Then he pressed 2 fingers against the cold metal of the distributor housing and asked someone to turn the key just once, just long enough for the starter to engage without draining the battery entirely. The engine cranked, that same hollow grinding sound the crowd had heard described in whispered stories for years. Mechanical effort without ignition, a heartbeat that never quite began no matter how many times it was asked to. Gideon listened to it the way a doctor listens to a stethoscope, his head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed in concentration as if the sound itself contained sentences only he could translate. One of the younger technicians standing nearby scoffed under his breath, muttering that the man was simply guessing, performing a show for an audience that had already made up its mind about how this would end. Gideon said nothing in response to the comment. He reached into the engine bay and, with careful, practiced hands, removed a small component from deep within the ignition assembly, and a part so unremarkable that most people in the room would never have known its name even if someone had told them. He held it up to the light, turned it slowly between his fingers, studying the machining marks along its edge with an intensity that silenced even the skeptics standing closest to him. A long moment passed, the only sound in the room, the faint hum of the overhead lighting rigs and the distant chatter of the crowd gathering outside the doors, unaware of what was unfolding behind them. Then something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition, the look of a man who has just found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been carrying in the back of his mind for years without realizing it. A small, quiet smile crossed his face. "So that's it," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone watching. He explained it plainly, without drama, the way a man might explain something he had known for years and simply never had the chance to say out loud. "The Bel Air," he told them, was not broken in the way anyone had assumed. In fact, it was closer to perfect than almost any restoration he had ever laid eyes on in his career. Every part had been sourced correctly. Every measurement matched the original factory specifications, every bolt torqued to exact tolerance, with a precision most shops never bothered to reach. There was only one flaw in the entire car, a single mistake made on the very first day of the restoration process, 6 years earlier, buried so deep in the ignition system that nobody had thought to question it since, hidden beneath layer after layer of otherwise flawless work. A replacement component, manufactured decades after the original factory part, had been installed with what looked like microscopic precision, to the naked eye, and even to most diagnostic tools calibrated to detect obvious mechanical failures. It appeared identical to the original 1957 part, but its internal tolerances were off by a margin so small it could barely be measured, a fraction of a millimeter in the timing mechanism that controlled exactly when the spark reached the cylinders. That tiny discrepancy, invisible to instruments designed to catch larger, cruder mistakes, had quietly thrown off the entire ignition sequence for 6 years, every single time someone turned the key hoping this attempt would be different. Every expert who examined the car had trusted the part simply because it was new, assuming without question that newer meant more accurate. Nobody had thought to question whether the reproduction had been machined with the same care as the original craftsman once used. Vivian stood frozen, the practiced composure draining slowly from her face as the weight of his words settled over the room like a held breath finally released. 6 years, she said quietly, almost to herself, the number suddenly sounding heavier than it ever had before. 6 years. And it was something that small. Gideon nodded, then reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and withdrew a small cloth bundle he had been carrying since before he ever knew this car existed. Unwrapped, it revealed a single aged component, its metal dulled by decades of use, rather than decades sitting untouched on a warehouse shelf, clearly salvaged from an old engine rather than manufactured yesterday in some overseas factory. This, he said, holding it up so the light caught its worn edges, came from an engine I pulled apart years ago, back when I still worked with racing systems every single day. Same part. Original tolerances. It's not pretty, but it's honest. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel enormous. The hum of the exhibition hall's lighting system, the distant murmur of the public crowd waiting outside the velvet ropes for the doors to finally open. Gideon knelt back down beside the open engine bay, working with the unhurried precision of a surgeon who had performed the same procedure 1,000 times before, though in truth, this exact procedure had never been performed on this particular car, until this exact moment in this exact building. He removed the flawed reproduction part with careful hands, set it aside on a folded rag, as if it deserved some measure of respect despite the trouble it had caused, and slid the aged original into its place, tightening each connection by feel rather than by manual, as though his fingers had memorized the geometry of this engine long before he had ever laid eyes on it. Vivienne watched with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, disbelief written plainly across her face for the first time all day. "It cannot possibly be that simple," she said, her voice sharper than she intended it to be. 6 years, dozens of the best specialists in the country, and the answer was a single part you happened to be carrying in your pocket this entire time. Gideon did not look up from his work. Sometimes the simplest answer is the one everyone assumes is too small to matter, he said quietly. People trust complexity because it feels like proof of effort. But engines don't care about effort, or reputation, or how much someone paid to have their name attached to a project. They only care about being right. He closed the hood gently, wiped his hands on the rag, and stood, brushing dust from his knees with the same calm patience he had shown since the moment he walked through the door. Without ceremony, without asking permission a second time, he reached toward the ignition and turned the key. The crowd around him seemed to lean forward as one body, holding a collective breath that had been building for 6 long years, waiting for the moment they had almost stopped believing would ever come. 1 second passed, then 2. The grinding deepened, caught, and suddenly the engine bay erupted with sound. A low, thunderous growl that rose and steadied into the unmistakable rhythm of a V8 engine running exactly as its designers had intended nearly 70 years earlier. The sound rolled through the hangar like a wave, bouncing off the metal walls, filling every corner of the building until it seemed to shake the very air itself, rattling loose bolts on nearby display stands and startling pigeons from the rafters above. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Photographers who had spent their entire careers capturing beautiful, silent cars stood frozen, cameras forgotten at their sides, listening to something that felt less like machinery and more like a resurrection unfolding right in front of them. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, a single set of hands somewhere near the back of the crowd, before it swelled into a roar nearly as loud as the engine itself. Several of the older specialists, men who had spent decades around classic cars and rarely showed emotion in public settings, wiped quickly at their eyes and pretended it was dust from the garage floor irritating them. Vivienne stood perfectly still at the center of it all, one hand pressed against her chest, her carefully composed expression finally cracking into something raw and unguarded that she had not allowed herself to feel in public for years. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, though she fought visibly against letting them fall in front of the crowd she had spent years cultivating and impressing. Gideon reached over and, without asking, turned the key back and shut the engine off. The sudden silence felt almost as powerful as the sound had been. A stillness, thick enough to touch. "Don't drive it," he said flatly. Before anyone in the crowd could suggest exactly that, Vivienne blinked, confusion cutting sharply through the relief that had only just begun to settle over her. "It's running," she said. "It's finally running, after 6 years. Why on earth would we not drive it right now, tonight, while everyone here can witness it?" Gideon shook his head slowly, already reaching back into his toolbox for a different set of tools. He explained that while listening to the engine in those first few seconds, beneath the triumphant roar that had brought the whole room to its feet, he had caught something else. A faint irregularity buried deep in the rhythm, so subtle that only someone who had spent a lifetime listening to engines the way other people listened to music would have noticed it at all. There was a second problem, he told her, one far more dangerous than the first had ever been. The ignition timing issue had been merely preventing the car from starting, frustrating but ultimately harmless in the long run. This new issue was different in a way that mattered far more. If the Bel Air were driven even a short distance in its current state, the imbalance he had detected could cause catastrophic internal damage within minutes, the kind of failure that would destroy the engine permanently and reduce 6 years of painstaking restoration to a pile of scrap metal beyond saving. No matter how much money anyone was willing to spend afterward, nobody in the crowd had noticed it. None of the specialists, none of the engineers with their decades of combined experience and their expensive equipment had caught what Gideon heard in those first few seconds of ignition, buried beneath the celebration and the noise. Vivienne studied him carefully, her earlier disbelief now shifting into something closer to genuine curiosity, mixed with a growing respect she had not expected to feel toward a stranger in a stained jacket. "How could you possibly know that, just from listening?" she asked, her tone softer now than it had been all morning. Nobody else here heard anything wrong at all. Gideon was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the closed hood as though he were listening to an echo only he could hear replaying itself. "Years ago," he said finally, "I designed high-performance ignition systems for racing engines. Not restoration work like this. Competition work, the kind where a fraction of a second in timing meant the difference between winning a championship and blowing an engine in front of a national television audience and every sponsor who had ever trusted the team with their name." He explained, in the same unhurried, unembellished tone he used for everything, that a serious accident on a test track years earlier had ended that chapter of his life abruptly and violently, taking with it several months of his hearing in one ear and any illusion that the sport was worth the risk it demanded. Not long after, his marriage had ended as well, the strain of long absences and constant pressure finally proving too much for either of them to carry through years of missed birthdays and canceled plans. He had walked away from the industry entirely, retreating into a small garage where the only thing that mattered was doing the work honestly, one car at a time, with no cameras and no deadlines and no shareholders watching over his shoulder, waiting for quarterly results. He asked for permission to remove the entire cylinder head assembly, a request that visibly startled several of the specialists standing nearby, who exchanged uneasy glances at the idea of dismantling a car that had just, for the first time in 6 years, roared to life in front of everyone. Vivian studied Gideon for a long moment, weighing the humiliation of the last 6 years against the strange, quiet certainty in this stranger's voice, a certainty that had already proven itself correct once already that morning. Finally, she nodded. "Do what you need to do," she said, and stepped back to give him room. As Gideon worked, methodically disassembling the top of the engine with tools that looked decades old but moved in his hands with flawless precision, one of the older engineers standing at the edge of the crowd went suddenly pale, his eyes narrowing as some distant memory surfaced. He stepped forward slowly, studying Gideon's face with the unsettled expression of a man piecing together a memory from long ago that he had not thought about in years. "Wait," he said quietly, then louder, "Wait, I know you." The room turned toward him as he pointed, his voice trembling slightly with disbelief he could barely contain. "You're the one they used to call the ignition whisperer." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion mixing with growing recognition among the older specialists present, several of whom began whispering to one another and nodding as pieces of an old story fell back into place. The engineer explained, his words tumbling out faster now, that nearly 2 decades earlier there had been a young engineer in the racing world whose intuitive understanding of ignition systems had become something of a legend among insiders, a man capable of diagnosing engine problems that defeated every diagnostic machine available at the time, simply by listening, by touching, by trusting instincts built from thousands of hours spent with his hands inside running engines under pressure that would break most people. Several major manufacturers had reportedly tried to recruit him for executive engineering positions over the years, offering salaries and titles that would have made him wealthy and comfortable many times over for the rest of his life. He had turned every single one down, choosing instead to disappear into obscurity, favoring quiet, honest craftsmanship over recognition and corporate ladders that would have pulled him further from the work he actually loved. Vivian stared at Gideon with an expression that had shifted entirely from skepticism into something closer to awe. She pulled out her phone and began searching quietly while he continued working on the engine. And within minutes, her expression had changed again, this time into something like disbelief layered over quiet shame at her own earlier words. She discovered, scrolling through old restoration records and enthusiast forums dedicated to classic American cars, that several of the most celebrated award-winning restorations of the past decade, cars that had won major trophies at exactly the kind of prestigious events she attended every year and bragged about at dinner parties, had quietly been guided behind the scenes by an anonymous consultant who never once appeared in any press coverage or accepted public credit for his work, no matter how much attention the finished cars received. The signature diagnostic style described in those old posts, the reliance on sound and touch, rather than machines, matched exactly what she had just watched Gideon perform in front of her only moments earlier. She lowered the phone slowly, studying the man kneeling beside her car with new eyes, seeing him for what felt like the first time since he had walked through the door that morning. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter now, stripped entirely of its earlier confidence and edge. "Why would you help build so many winning cars and never once let anyone know it was you behind the work?" Gideon paused his work for a moment, wiping his hands on the rag before answering, choosing his words with the same care he used on every bolt. "I never did it for the trophies," he said simply. "I did it because the cars deserved to run the way they were built to run, the way the men who designed them all those years ago intended them to sound and move and feel. Recognition was never the part that mattered to me, and chasing it always seemed like it would only get in the way of the work itself." He finished reassembling the cylinder head with the same unhurried precision he had used to remove it, tightening each bolt in a careful sequence that seemed to follow a pattern only he understood, one built from years of instinct rather than any manual. When he finally stepped back, wiping his hands one last time on a rag gone nearly black with grease, he turned the key again, and this time the engine caught immediately, settling into a smooth, steady rhythm that even the untrained ears in the crowd could recognize as fundamentally different from the powerful but subtly flawed roar they had heard minutes earlier. This one sounded right, in a way the first attempt never had, balanced and effortless, like a voice finally speaking in its true register, after years of straining against something it was never built to fight. Vivian reached into her coat and produced the check she had promised, already signed. The number filled in with the careless confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems with money and rarely questioned about it. She held it out to Gideon, who looked at it for a long moment without taking it from her hand. "I don't want it," he said finally. The room fell quiet again, disbelief rippling through the crowd at the sight of a working-class mechanic turning down $1 million in front of dozens of witnesses who would surely tell this story for years to come. "I'll take a fair rate for the hours I put in today," he continued, "and nothing more than that." Vivienne studied him, searching his face for some hidden angle, some negotiation tactic she had simply failed to anticipate after years of reading people for a living, but found nothing there except quiet sincerity that unsettled her more than any counteroffer could have. "The car needed to be fixed properly," he said, folding the rag and placing it back inside his toolbox with the same care he gave everything else. "Not so I could prove I was smarter than the people who came before me and failed. It just needed to be right, and that was reason enough." Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, visibly moved by a display of humility so rare in a world usually defined by ego and reputation and the size of one's bank account. Somewhere near the back, a photographer lowered her camera and simply watched, sensing correctly that this moment would matter more than anything she could capture through a lens no matter how well she framed it. By the following morning, the story dominating conversation across every corner of the classic car world was no longer about the record-breaking restoration budget or the rare 1957 Bel Air with the flawless provenance. It was about the quiet, unassuming mechanic who had walked into a private garage uninvited and solved a problem that the country's most credentialed experts had failed to solve for 6 consecutive years, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a rag, and an old part carried in his pocket. Later that same afternoon, as the exhibition floor buzzed with the news spreading from booth to booth faster than anyone could contain it, the event organizers gathered the judging panel for an emergency meeting behind closed doors. Word had already begun to circulate among the other exhibitors and specialists in attendance, and by the time the panel reconvened an hour later, they had reached a decision nobody in the room had anticipated only hours earlier that morning. They announced, over the hangar's speaker system, a special addition to that year's program, an unprecedented recognition award for outstanding technical achievement in automotive restoration, to be presented alongside the primary trophies during the following evening's closing ceremony. When the day of the awards ceremony finally arrived, the Bel Air sat gleaming under the exhibition lights, its engine now running as flawlessly as its polished chrome suggested it should from the very beginning. The judging panel, after careful and lengthy deliberation, awarded it the highest honor of the entire competition, a trophy Vivienne had chased for 6 long years through frustration, disappointment, and nearly 6 figures spent chasing solutions that never once worked as promised. When her name was called to accept the award, she walked to the small stage set up at the center of the hangar, but instead of simply accepting the trophy and delivering the polished speech her assistant had drafted for her the night before, she turned to the crowd and asked that Gideon join her under the lights. He hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention turned entirely toward him, but eventually made his way through the parted crowd, his boots still faintly marked with the same grease that had made security mistake him for a delivery driver only 3 days earlier. Standing beside him under the bright lights, Vivienne addressed the crowd directly, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly present just beneath the surface of every word. She admitted, without hedging or softening the truth for the sake of her own image, that she had judged this man by his clothing and his silence, assuming that someone who looked the way he did could not possibly understand something that had defeated every credentialed expert money could buy. She apologized publicly, not because it was expected of her by anyone in that room, but because she genuinely meant every word she said. The specialists standing near the stage, many of whom had laughed along with her only days earlier without a second thought, rose to their feet and applauded. a slow, genuine ovation that spread through the entire hangar until every person in the building was standing together. Vivienne then made an offer she had clearly been considering since the previous afternoon, proposing that the two of them partner to establish a restoration center, a place built not around prestige or price tags or famous names on a letterhead, but around genuine skill and honest craftsmanship, where mechanics like Gideon would finally receive the recognition and respect, too often reserved only for those with the right connections or the right last name attached to their work. Gideon considered the offer carefully before agreeing, but only under a short list of conditions he laid out plainly and without room for negotiation. The center could not carry his name on its sign or its letterhead, because the work itself had never been about him, and never would be. Every vehicle brought through its doors would be restored according to its true historical accuracy, rather than whatever modern shortcuts made the job faster or more profitable for the business. And any apprentice who came through its program would be judged purely on the skill of their hands and the sharpness of their instincts, never on their appearance, their background, or their ability to talk confidently in a room full of wealthy collectors who mistook confidence for competence. Vivienne agreed without hesitation, extending her hand toward him in front of the entire crowd, and Gideon shook it firmly, the quiet understanding between them needing no further words to seal an arrangement that would shape both of their lives for years to come. As the ceremony wound down and the crowd slowly dispersed into the cool autumn evening, the Bel Air was finally driven, carefully and deliberately, out through the wide hangar doors and into the fading light of dusk, settling over the parking lot. Vivienne sat behind the wheel for the first time in 6 years, her hands resting with quiet disbelief against the same steering wheel that had once belonged to a car she had begun to believe might never run at all, no matter how much of her fortune she poured into it. Gideon sat beside her in the passenger seat, saying nothing, simply listening to the steady, even rhythm of an engine, finally breathing the way its original engineers had intended nearly 70 years earlier, a sound that no amount of money could have purchased without the right pair of hands to find it. The sound rolled gently across the parking lot as the sun sank low over the horizon, painting the chrome in shades of amber and gold, and for a long stretch of road, neither of them spoke at all, because for the first time in 6 long years, nothing more needed to be said between them. In the weeks that followed, the small garage on the edge of the county slowly emptied out, its tools packed carefully into crates, and driven north to a converted warehouse. Vivienne had purchased specifically for the new venture. She had wanted glass walls and polished floors, the kind of showroom finish befitting a project that would carry both their reputations. But Gideon had insisted otherwise, arguing that the work mattered more than the building around it. They settled instead on something plain and functional: concrete floors that could take the weight of a lift, wide bay doors that let in the afternoon light, and shelves lined with parts sorted not by price but by era, each drawer labeled in Gideon's own careful handwriting. Word of what had happened at the exhibition spread quickly through collector circles across the country, and within a season the new center had more requests for restoration work than it could reasonably accept, a fact that Gideon treated with the same calm indifference he brought to everything else. He turned away far more clients than he accepted, choosing instead to focus on cars whose stories deserved the kind of patience most shops no longer had time to give. Vivienne, for her part, learned to step back from decisions that once would have been entirely hers to make. Trusting instincts she had spent years dismissing in favor of spreadsheets and appraisals. The two of them argued occasionally, as any two strong-willed people building something new together inevitably would, but the disagreements never lingered long, dissolving quickly under the shared understanding that had formed between them the day an engine finally roared back to life after 6 years of silence. The first apprentice to walk through the new center's doors was a young woman from 2 counties over who had spent her teenage years rebuilding an old tractor engine in her family's barn, with nothing but borrowed tools and stubborn patience. She had no formal training, no diploma from any technical school, and no connections to speak of, only a pair of steady hands and an ear that Gideon recognized within the first 10 minutes of watching her work. He hired her on the spot. Over the objections of an advisory board, Vivienne had assembled that preferred credentials over demonstrated skill, and within a year, she had become one of the most sought-after young restorers in the region, her reputation built entirely on the quality of her work, rather than the letters after her name. Some machines, it turned out, did not need more money to come back to life. They only needed to be understood by someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to listen for what everyone else had stopped trying to hear.